So I welcome everyone for the first lecture actually of the Griekenlandcentrum of this year, which will be in English and which will be given by no one less than Matthew Payne, who is now a guest lecturer in at Gent University, right, in Latin literature, and who will tell us more about the influence of Greek tragedy in Latin tragedy. So yeah, I give you the word, Matthew.
It's a great pleasure to have the chance to speak today, and yeah, my particular thanks to Isabel for the invitation and the introduction, and also to the rest of the Griekenlandcentrum team for organising this event. En ook mijn excuses dat de lezing niet in het Nederlands is. Er was niet genoeg tijd om een nieuwe lezing te schrijven. So you'll have to suffer with my English, but I hope it's okay. So tonight I'd like to talk a little about my research, which is focused on Roman Republican tragedy, and the relationship between the plays of Ennius, Aeschylus, and the other Roman Republican tragedians and their ancient Greek predecessors is one of the central concerns and ongoing questions in the field. And typically in my own research, then I'm looking backwards, so to speak, from the Roman Republican tragedies to principally the Greek tragedies of the Attic stage, written by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. And this is also the stance in which most research in Roman Republican tragedy is done. But I'm very conscious that I'm addressing the Griekenlandcentrum tonight, not the Italiacentrum, and it's also possible to give a slightly different narrative, which is all about moving forward and transformation. So whichever perspective, whichever starting point that we take, tonight I'm going to be touching on a story that combines both the search for origins and the possibilities of creative transformation. So let me just share my slide and we can get started. So hopefully, and now I have to move, so I can't now see anyone. So if there's something happening, you'll have to shout. So to be a little bit more concrete about what I'll be talking about, I'll be starting with some brief stage setting, so to speak, briefly expressing a little of the relative wealth of knowledge that we have about ancient Greek drama, and then to rather more slowly state our relative lack of knowledge about early Roman tragedy. I'll then move on to try and illustrate some of the processes of cross-cultural translation and creative transformation that we can place under this umbrella term of translation, particularly instances which illustrate the collision of Greek and Roman culture. And there are many examples in Roman Republican tragedy. And I'll only be able to dip into them this evening. Finally, I'll demonstrate some examples where the idea of translation suddenly seems a bit shaky. And in the process, that will hopefully give a taste of both how much there is still to be explored and how little we perhaps really know, and also how dependent we are for that scarce knowledge on the tangled threads of tradition that stretch all the way back to when these texts were written in antiquity. So, in the spirit of starting with Greece, let me try to sum up the riches of Attic tragedy in 100 words. So, the earliest years are a little bit murky, but at least by the 5th century, performances of tragedy were the central parts of the Dionysia, an Athenian civic festival. The performances were competitive, and 3 playwrights successively took their turns to present a trilogy of tragedies and a satire play in the open air before the eyes of thousands of their fellow citizens. Attic tragedy included not just spoken dialogue, but also sung choral dances. The familiar names of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides all completed with their plays over many years in the Dionysia. And we still have many of these plays today. So that was 100 words, and enough of Attic Greek drama for the time being. But what of Roman Republican drama? We know a lot less. Livius Andronicus, who traditionally inaugurated literature in Rome by producing a translation of Homer's Odyssey in Latin, was also credited with being the first person to stage tragedy in Latin in 240 BC, if we trust the Roman orator Marcus Tullius Cicero, writing 200 years later. 240 BC was the year after Rome had burst onto the world stage by triumphing over its North African rival city-state, Carthage, in the First Punic War. And if there's an obvious big three in Attic tragedy, we should probably talk about a big five in Roman publican tragedy: the aforementioned Livius Andronicus, Naevius, Ennius, Pacuvius, and Accius. And Livius, Naevius, and Ennius were also writers of the first epic poems in Latin. And here on this slide, then I put up all the tragedies that we know about, that they wrote, and which we have surviving fragments or some testimonial about. And this doesn't seem like too bad at all. It's enough to talk about, surely. But here we hit the big problem with Roman publican tragedy. It's all in pieces, quite literally. And we have a tiny fraction of what was once written and performed. Now, that's true of Greek tragedy too. The amount of plays produced and performed at the Dionysia in Athens each year, not to mention other dramatic festivals, not only in Athens, but around the Greek world, is far greater than the plays that survive to us. But at least with Greek tragedy, we have a few complete plays. We have plenty of fragments as well, such as here's some examples from Sophocles' satyr play, the Trackers, and Euripides' Cresfontes. But we don't have a single complete Roman publican tragedy by anybody. The only surviving Roman tragedies are by Seneca, but they're written 100 years after the fall of the Roman Republic under the emperors Claudius and Nero. Now, these Greek tragedies that survive in fragments, sometimes because a later writer like Stobaeus thought that a Sophoclean or European line was rather neat, but often through papyrus scraps like these that you can find in museums and libraries across the world, that were dug up in rubbish heaps in Oxyrhynchus or found in other spots around Egypt and other dry regions of the Greek world. So that means that we often get quite lengthy passages from, say, a lost Euripidean work, like this rather sizable portion of Euripides' Cresfontes. We might get a complete hypothesis or plot summary. That just isn't the case for Roman publican tragedies. Our fragments do not come to us as papyrus scraps like these, but as quotations embedded in other works, such as speeches by Cicero from the end of the Roman Republic, or a vast array of grammatical texts written over the course of several centuries of the Roman Empire into late antiquity and beyond. So what does this survival by quotation look like in practice? Well, here is a page from the dictionary of Nonius Marcellus, a North African grammarian who lived probably in the 4th or 5th century BC, we can't be entirely sure. This is a 9th century copy of a manuscript that was made in Tours in France. Nonius collects examples of all kinds of unusual words, and I've highlighted in red one entry, or a part of one entry, for exemplare, which Nonius that gives a definition as perpetuity, to endure. The first, and he illustrates these definitions with quotations, which also serve the purpose of showing that he's right about his definition. And in this example, the quotation that Nonius cites, the first one he gives for exemplare, is from Ennius's Andromache. On the other side of the slides, I don't know if I can have a red marker pen, but you'll have to, I don't think you see the point of it. if you look on the right-hand side, it should be relatively clear. There are two examples of how this quotation from Ennius and Andromache that's preserved in Ennius's text then appears in editions of Ennius's fragments. At the top is Stephanus' edition that was printed in early modern Geneva. And at the bottom is how the fragment appears in the third edition of the tragic fragments made by Otto Rebeck in late 19th century Germany. There is a lot that can be said about quotation and transmission across the different authors who provide us with our Roman tragic fragments, but I won't delve too deeply into that now. But it is worth stating this because this context and this survival and this transmission is crucial in terms of how we understand the fragments and how often it has a great significance in how we can interpret and what we can make of the fragments. So scholars cannot ever afford to lose sight of this context and of this manner of transmission. The fragments that we have from the Roman publican tragedians only survive because they were embedded inside other texts, often put to radically different usage from how they would have appeared perhaps on the Roman publican stage. So here is what Roman publican tragic fragments look like from a transmission perspective, from the qualitative level. What does it look like on a quantitative level? So here at the top is every single line from Sophocles' Antigone. I promise that if you have very, very sharp eyesight and a very, very large screen with plenty of pixels, you would be able to read all 1,353 lines. So it's a bit dependent on what editors delete or not of the transmitted text, but we have the entirety of the play pretty much. We have its dialogue, we have its choruses, we have a sense of who spoke the lines, which character voiced the lines of each line of dialogue. We don't have perhaps everything that we could know about the performance. Film was only invented in the 20th century, so what we don't have is the record, so to speak, of what that actually looked like to watch it in the theatre of Dionysus in Athens on the slopes of the Acropolis. But since we do still have the complete text, we can still draw lots of inferences about how it was performed as well. And then on the bottom right of the side, you see what we have of Aeschylus' Antigone, and it's in rather a different state. So this is as it's presented in Otto Rebeck's 19th century edition. And he provides us with these 6 fragments. And this play would have been, we have to imagine, written to be a comparable length to Sophocles' play. And yet there is, if that number of lines is about right, we have less than 100th of it of Aeschylus' play left. And it's in pieces. It's a very broken thing. And this is the story of every single Republican Roman tragedy. Sometimes we might have a few more fragments. We might get lucky and have 20 or 30 or, yeah, that's about the upper limit of fragments. And sometimes we can have a lot less. Sometimes we only have a title and maybe some testimonial about when it was performed or some story about its performance. We are looking at a story of catastrophic loss. So, is it all doom and gloom? Why would anyone try to read these scraps of Roman tragedy when one can read full plays by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides? very good plays? Well, there are a few different reasons to do so. And I want to say a bit about a few of these reasons and zoom in a bit on some particular ones. So the first is to get a glimpse of the origins of Roman literature. I'm aware I'm talking to a crowd of Greece enthusiasts, but as a Latinist, I'm obliged to defend its literature, which is no less rich or interesting. And Republican tragedy laid seeds which we can see sprouted in the works of Catullus, of Lucretius, of Virgil, and a host of other great Roman authors. We only have to read a few words from the 5th century writer Macrobius to realize the great shadow that Ennius cast over Virgil's work, not only through his epic, the Annals, but also through his tragedy. But this is perhaps not the most interesting thing that I want to talk about today. We can also look at what this very early chapter tells us about the interaction between Greece and Rome. The writers of early Latin literature were hugely influenced by their Greek predecessors. Ennius famously declared that he had 3 hearts: Oscan, Greek, and Latin. But the saying also highlights that our early writers are so often intermediaries, in between people, so to speak, in between Greek and Roman culture in some ways. As Cicero tells it, then Livius Andronicus was a Greek from Tarentum who was brought to Rome by a Roman general as a slave after the fall of Tarentum in 272 BC. Romans such as Cicero saw their literary origins as beginning with translation, the importing of Greek culture into Rome. It's perhaps no coincidence that at the same time Rome was conquering the Greek world, very visibly and physically bringing Greek culture into the heart of Rome in the form of statuary and other kinds of art taken from Greek cities by conquest, in the festivals hosted and funded by members of the Roman elite in a competitive style, playwrights were staging very Greek-looking plays. Roman translation of Greek works often has a competitive, even aggressive element, as Siobhan McElduff has pointed out. We have some fragments of so-called fabulae praetextae, which stage stories about Roman heroes from the very distant and semi-mythic past. We have a story about Brutus, who slew the tyrant Tarquin and inaugurated the Roman Republic. We also have some fabulae praetextae about rather more recent events, such as major military campaigns in Greece. But the scarcity of fragments that survive from this genre suggests that it might actually not have been so popular. We have vastly more of the fabulae crepidatae, or plays in Greek dress, named after the sandal, the distinctive Greek sandal worn by the actors, whose titles, plots, and characters would all have been marvelously and unmistakably Greek to a Roman audience, even if they were in Latin. And these are the vast, vast, vast bulk of our Roman Republican tragedies. So this brings us to one of the most interesting things about Roman Republican tragedy. If they were translations of Greek tragedies, they were also transformations of them. Here is a rather nice mosaic from the house of the tragic poet in Pompeii. Obviously, it's since it's from Pompeii, it's rather a bit later than the period we're talking about, but it is a rather nice little illustration of Roman actors with their masks and an Aulus player playing the double flute there. But anyway, talking about translation, if Roman Republican tragedy often were translations of Greek tragedies, they were also transformations. We often nowadays set up a dichotomy between translation, where we perhaps expect a translated text to cross linguistically between languages, but otherwise stick rather close to the semantics and concepts and themes of the text that it translates. And on the other hand, adaptation, where we expect something rather looser, a greater creativity in the new text that is produced. But our preconceptions about translation versus adaptation would be rather alien to a Roman and to the Roman world at large. The concept of translation to a Roman, and there are a whole gamut of words and terms that were used to mean to translate in Latin. The concept of translation to a Roman could embrace something very literal and word for word, and also something that took very creative liberties. When we look at how later authors describe the early Roman playwrights, someone like Cicero, whose words I have up here, could talk in one work about word for word translation as something the Roman publican tragedians participated in, and then in another work describe the early Roman tragedians as not using the same words as the Greeks, but rather communicating in the same spirit. Now, translation, even when it is linguistically close, is still an opportunity for cross-cultural transformation. Here, for instance, is an example from Ennius's Medea, highlighted by Ingo Gildenhard. In many ways, it is a pretty close translation linguistically of Euripides' Medea, but it's still not exactly word for word by any means. In particular, I want to highlight the phrases sub armis and in Ennius versus paraspeda sternae in the Euripidean text. Now, at this moment, in both plays, it seems fairly clear in Ennius, even if we do have this one line in no context, that Medea is talking about how she would rather stand and fight 3 times in a battle than have to give birth once. Now, Ennius uses the word sub armis, and that corresponds to Euripides' paraspeda sternae. And to translate the phrases, Ennius' Medea would rather stand under arms than stand with a shield, as the Medea of Euripides declares. Why this change? Euripides is writing for an Athenian audience in the 5th century, whose soldiers would fight in a phalanx formation, a tight shield wall, where the shield of each soldier also covered the fellow soldier to his left. Now, by contrast, Ennius's Roman audience, and there would have been a substantial number of soldiers in the audience who had seen active service probably at this period in Rome's history. In fact, many of the members of the Roman elite who would be responsible for the financing and sponsoring of the dramatic festival may well have been, will have probably served in the army as officers. Now, so Ennius's Roman audience would rather have been familiar with a far looser battle formation, where soldiers could be expected to operate rather more independently of the soldier next to them. It simply wouldn't have rung quite the same if Ennius had translated Euripides with the emphasis upon the shield. Now, war is not the only area where playwrights had to reinterpret Greek source texts for their Roman target audience. To move to Ennius's Iphigenia, it seems to have begun, rather like Euripides' Iphigenia, with a description of the constellations in the night sky. In Euripides' Iphigenia, this description of constellations features in a long speech by Agamemnon at the beginning of the play. Now, I've also included the context here from Varro. Varro is the grammarian who's a very early grammarian, one of who transmits the line. And it's worth highlighting, is also interested because it illustrates some of the different terms that the Greeks and Romans have for the same things. They have slightly different terms for describing the same constellation in the sky. So Varro is quoting this line in order to introduce the Roman vision of the constellation of the plough, but the Greek's terms for it are slightly different. But I think what is even more interesting about these Ennian lines is that Ennius has actually changed the constellation that appears in Euripides' Iphigenia at Aulis. So Euripides, sorry, we'll skip one slide too many. Euripides actually talks about the Pleiades, which is a completely different set of stars in the night sky. This isn't the only difference between the passages, but it perhaps is the most pertinent one to talk about. So let's focus in on this difference between the Pleiades in Euripides and the plough in Ennius. They really are in completely different portions of the sky. I've got a map of, oh, I'm skipping ahead, sorry. Here is a diagram of some of the constellations in the night sky. I think this is more from a Northern European perspective. I think it was quite hard to find an exact star map for what a Roman or a Greek might have been seeing in the night sky in winter. But here you can at least see that if you look towards the top, sorry, math is a bit sensitive. You look towards the top of the slide, you can see Ursa Major, and the 7 stars in Ursa Major are also known as the plough in many cultures, or yeah, similar things to the plough. So these 7 stars are what Ennius is referring to when he talks about the wagon pole. But the Pleiades, on the other hand, is actually towards the bottom of the slide here. If you look at number 16 on the star map, just above Taurus, that very tight cluster of stars there is the Pleiades. So from 1 and 2 all the way down to 16, this is quite a big shift. And here's a little bit more detail about how you can find the Pleiades. You find Orion and his belt, and you follow his bow, and you get to the Pleiades. And they're traditionally 7 nymphs, I think, in the night sky, along with their parents, Pleione and Atlas. Whereas the bear is, yeah, as we said, found in a completely different portion of the sky. Is a rather different arrangement of 7 stars, and looks rather different in the night sky, being much more spread out. So why? Here's a passage on from the commentary of Jocelyn, containing his explanation. In Ennius, the reference to Ursa Major seems to concern the time of night. It's late. And so too in Euripides, with his usage of the Pleiades. But they're using different constellations to express this time. And it must be because their respective audiences in Greece and in Rome would have used different constellations for this purpose too in their own lives. If Ennius had just translated Euripides word for word and had his character speak of the Pleiades, his Roman audience would have completely missed the point and thought that he was not talking about the time of night, but his emphasis was really on the time of year. Now, there seems to be a very simple but clear case where a new cultural context required a transformation if it was to communicate anything of value to its new audience. It's somewhat trivial and yet a revealing example of Cicero's principle that the Roman tragedians translated non verbis et vim, not the words, but the force. And it illustrates the Roman tragedians' potential to, while they were dealing with something that would have felt very foreign to their audience, but at times they were capable of domesticating it, to making it a little bit more familiar to their audience. So those are a few examples where we can see translation from Greek tragedy to Roman tragedy as something a bit more involved than a purely linguistic activity. But I want to pivot finally slightly to from the Roman playwrights themselves to us modern scholars who go about trying to piece together and interpret their work. Inevitably, we often use the much better surviving Greek tragedies to make a bit more sense of their own tragedies. And sometimes this works very well. Sometimes it feels like a bit of a wild goose chase, potentially. And sometimes it can be a bit misleading. I want to show an example in a second from Ennius's Iphigenia. And in this example, I'm really interested in how scholars have gone about reconstructing what might be going on in a fragment and what its context might have been. And the reason I have a picture of a diagram of DNA from a biology textbook up on the side here is that I think this is not a terrible analogy in terms of the double helix structure. So DNA has this double helix structure, and each pair has a complementary base pair on the other side of the strand. They fit together very tightly. And I think sometimes it can be, well, it's quite easy for scholarly reconstructors, and when we're trying to make sense of these Roman tragic fragments, when we know that there are examples of very close correspondences between Greek and Roman tragedies at times, to think that where there is information missing from a Roman tragedy, all we really have to do is find the corresponding strand, the corresponding part on the corresponding part of the strand in the corresponding complete Greek tragedy, and we'll be able to fill in what is missing in the Roman tragedy. But this can often get more than a little problematic. So an example. Here is a fragment quoted by the Virgilian commentator Servius to illustrate the use of the word vastus in Virgil's Aeneid. It concerns some virgines, virgin girls, who are now, according to the speaker, widowed and abandoned by her addressee. It's more than a bit cryptic, and as you can see, there's certainly no critical consensus about who the speaker might be. If I just show you who the addressee might be and what the line as a whole might be about. For instance, Bota, if you look at the very top, thought the speaker might be Clytemnestra, and she might be addressing her husband, the Greek general Agamemnon, who's already come up. She's blaming him for starting the Trojan War, in Bota's opinion. But quite a few editors and critics have thought it's the other way around, such as Vardon and Warmington. They thought that it was Agamemnon blaming Clytemnestra because she left her other daughters all alone at home by sailing to Aulis with Iphigenia. And then Otto Ribbeck had a completely different suggestion. He thought that the speaker was actually Iphigenia, who is apostrophizing Helen rather than speaking to any character on stage. And on this suggestion, the content, the underlying rationale of the line is that Iphigenia is blaming Helen for the whole dramatic situation that has brought about her death, and speaking of herself in a generalizing plural. It's a little bit odd. So what might give rise to these rather different hypotheses, which really differ quite strikingly in terms of speaker and industry as subject, what might be going on, the context, the placement, where these lines might occur in the play. So more than anything, if you see this final category that I've added in, it's really the parallels that critics identify with Euripidean text that shapes their reconstructions. And moreover, critics who prefer the same Euripidean parallel pretty much uniformly offer the same reconstruction. This isn't surprising particularly, but the results are really rather very different. Different parallels give rise to completely different interpretations. For instance, some of the parallel with a choral passage rather than a dialogue spoken in iambic trimeters. These different parallels don't turn out to be similar at all in terms of content or delivery or context. But they're all supposed to be stirred and spurred by the same Ennian line. The fact that different critics can point to wildly different parallels for the same Roman tragic fragment means that this process of reconstruction is far from as simple as sometimes scholars can present it. Imperfect correspondences driven by the Roman playwrights' own creative transformations is the underlying story of Roman tragedy. And the two strands of mirrored and interlocking DNA with the complete Greek tragedy illuminating and disambiguating the imperfect Roman tragedy is unfortunately something of a pipe dream. We can also see that later Romans were well aware of the creative transformations that the Roman Republican tragedians had worked on their Greek predecessors. However, their responses could be quite various. And in a far more integrated world, where Greek and Roman culture were rubbing up alongside each other much more closely than in the early years of in the mid years of the Roman Republic, then these writers could have rather a different opinion on them than perhaps than we assume an early Roman audience would have done, given what the Roman Republican playwrights were going about doing. So here is a passage from the 2nd century AD author Gellius, and you can see the Euripidean lines that he's referring to and Ennian lines referring to indented. But he's comparing a passage of Ennius's Hecuba with Euripides' Hecuba. It is a rather exceptional instance in many ways in the ancient world of a comparative reading of a source text and its translation. Now, Gellius compliments Ennius's translation, but he highlights that opulenti and ignobiles are rather different in semantic value and association to the terms that Euripides uses. Again, this seems like a rather obvious example of creative transformation. Rather than reputation, Ennius has decided differentials of wealth will resonate rather more with his Roman audience of the 2nd century BC. So I hope that's given a taste of some of the fascination posed by the Roman tragic fragments, as well as their challenges. It's been a great pleasure to be able to speak to you tonight, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Let's all give some applause. It was very, very clear and honestly very interesting. Thank you. Yeah, I don't know if someone has a question. I would say raise your hand and then we can unmute you or write in the chat. So I was myself wondering, because now you give a bit the impression that the research on the Latin tragedy is yeah, going to, that there's not that much more to do about it. But I know that you work on it. So what are you still what are you still researching on in those texts?
Oh well, there's plenty. I mean, there are a lot of fragments, right? So
yeah, okay,
we do have a lot of plays, and there are a lot of fragments. And as I say, I've only pointed out a few instances here, but it is quite surprising how a little fragment can actually sort of produce a whole load of different mysteries and questions. So I would rather focus on perhaps the ones that we have some answers to, rather than the ones that we're not sure about. I'm still always, I'm particularly interested in the way that editors in different periods and different times have interpreted this material, and it often does say a lot more potentially about the editor than what we can objectively say about the fragment. I skipped over this example from Scaliger, but if I maybe I can comment on this quickly, because I think it's rather a nice example from the early modern period. But basically, Scaliger is commenting on Varro's De Lingua Latina, and Varro himself is preserving some lines of Republican literature, but what Scaliger, Varro is actually quoting from a rustic comedy, but how Scaliger responds to it is that he sees the lines as actually fitting into it as actually coming from Aeschylus's Bacchae, because the lines seem to strike him as quite close to the Euripidean Bacchae. So we have here like a very sort of creative response, and really does kind of illustrate this this kind of double helix analogy, that often is very tempting, and this goes no less for modern scholars, even if we're not doing perhaps quite the same creative approach that Scaliger is doing. It's still very sometimes easy to kind of see the things that seem to look possibly like they are similarities, and then build rather big castles in the sky out of them. So just tracing some of these, some of what editors have done and how they've kind of responded to the fragments is you can quite there's quite a lot of material to look at. So yeah, there's still plenty of work to be done, and although I'm saying lots there's a staggering amount lost, there are a decent number of fragments still to talk about, and since each one can often poses its own particular problems and challenges of interpretation, there really is a lot that one can still do with many of these fragments. So very much not over and dusted. It really is, and it's definitely a growing field. If you so these fragmentary texts sort of fell out a bit of fashion, let's say, after 19th century philology. So over the course of the 20th century, then they went a bit unattended, perhaps. But I would say in the sort of in recent years, there's really been a lot of great work being done on the fragments themselves, but also the broader issues of interpreting and fragments and how fragments have been transmitted, and how that adds a whole number of other layers, because you really can't depend on someone quoting these lines to necessarily give you an accurate picture of it. And you have to think very carefully about what the relationship might be between a quoting text and the text that's being quoted inside it.
Mm. Yeah. Thank you. I'm happy you will not be soon out of work. I I see that Teresa has a question. I will.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I really agree with you, and I think it's important to stress this kind of things. I just want to add something about the passage from Cicero, the Finibus, part about the word-for-word translation, because I don't think that that passage should be taken seriously, actually, because he's talking about, he just wants to differentiate his translation of philosophy from the translation of tragedy, and that's the reason why he uses the diminutive fabellas, which is used in a pejorative sense. So I don't think that anyone in ancient Rome would have seen something like that, ancient drama is translated word for word, and that's the reason why in the Academica it then said that they are translated non-verba, said the whim. So maybe that's not a contradiction between these two passages, just another reason to say that in the Finibus. What do you think about it?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree that I did skip over some of the context of these Ciceronian passages quite a bit there, and yeah, it's very important with those statements, as with Cicero's own quotation of the tragedy text, to think about what is driving, what is Cicero's reason for talking about them in this way. And Cicero always has some agenda and some particular spin that he wants to put on things. And so yeah, and absolutely in this instance, it's the preface to his work, and he is justifying what he's doing. The concept, though, the idea that there is something that is close translation and there is something that is less close, just the ability of the Romans to get their head around that and to think about translation as something of a spectrum, but then to be very happy using thinking about translation as embracing all of this whole possibility. It's more what I but absolutely, like we have to be very careful about these Ciceronian discussions of tragedy and of translation, because he has his own ideas about translation that he is trying to push on his contemporary Roman audience. So yeah,
and of course, probably he would have used interpreter if he was talking about something word for word translated, not vertere, right?
So Siobhan Geldof has done talks a bit about this, but interpres seems to be more about spoken communication and quite kind of official capacity. So translation.
Not sure about, yeah, I know, but not sure about this interpretation, because think about Dennis Finney book, and he talked about the fact that interpreter is first used for spoken translation and then as a metaphor for a translation which resembles the spoken one. So a translation which is really literal. But yeah, basically, first it's a spoken translation, but not only.
Yeah, I think more that the idea that interpres would be word for word and other terms of translation would not be word for word. I would be very wary of that. So because there seem to be instances where we have language of expressum ad verba appearing in Cicero and in other writers as well, which, yeah, if word for word could only correspond to interpres, we would expect interpres there, for instance.
Of course, not only.
So yeah, it's difficult to make strict dichotomies between translation terms. Let's say maybe. But
thank you.
But yeah.
Okay, thank you. Maybe if there is one last question. If not, I would propose we all give again a round of applause for Matthew for this talk. And yeah, I hope to see everyone again for the next talk in somewhere next semester. And I wish everyone a nice evening.